Good morning, Moray Rabotai. We are continuing on Masechet Avodah Zarah, and we are on Daf Tet, Amud Bet. 4 lines from the top. Today's Amud is being learned. L'schud Yehoshua ben Diana, Yael bat Rivka, Menashe ben Asi. Today's Amud is also being learned. Leilu Nishmat, Tzipora bat Yitzchak. Now we are amidst basic mathematics of years of Beit HaMikdash relating to Churban, relating to different things of Yemot HaMashiach, how you calculate the amount of years until current time. One more of that, the Gemara says, how do you calculate the time of Shemitah year? We all know, every 7th year is going to be Shemitah, and Shemitah has perhaps nafkaminas, has practical application for many things. Whether Shemitah is deoraita or not is really a machloket. In Masechet Gitin, Daf Lamed Vav, the Gemara has a machloket between Rav and Shmuel whether or not Shemitah Ksafim, Shemitah of Karkaot, is deoraita or not. The understanding of Rav over there in the Gemara is that Shemitah Ksafim is like Shemitah Karkaot. That means, just like you don't have Shemitah of Karkaot when you don't have the majority of the Jews residing on Eretz Yisrael and Hashanim Ketiknan, Kesidran, Shemitah Ksafim also does not apply. That if you have lent people money and Shemitah passes over them, then you still could demand your money back, and the Shemitah is not mishameted. Others disagree. So if you say Rashi holds that Shemitah applies midrabanan at least, and others may disagree, but the maaseh at the end of the day, you need to know when Shemitah is to know when the halachot apply, when they don't apply. So how do you know if you don't have a calendar? How do you know which year is going to be the Shnat HaShemitah? Now, so the Gemara is going to say again a cheat sheet of calculating based on Churban Beit HaMikdash. This is a very time-appropriate Gemarot for Chodesh Av to learn. So the Gemara says Churban Beit HaMikdash was on Motza'e Shemitah. That means it was year 1 after Shemitah. So if you know when Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, then it's easy, because you add 1 year, so then you will be basically up to Shnat HaShemitah, year prior to Churban Beit HaMikdash, and from there on, let's count how easy it will be to count. It will be, if you say every Yovel is 50 years, right? So every 100 years you have 2 Yovels, you knock it out, and then you count the singles of the years that are left. Imagine if you have, let's say, 1900 years flat, and that means from the year of the Churban, so you add 1 year, because that was a year before the Churban, that was Shemitah, so it would be 1900 and plus 1 year. So you knock out the whole 1900, because that would be, a set amount of Yovels and Shemitahs, so that's gone, and you would be holding in 1 year into Shemitah. That means last year was Shemitah. And 6 years from now it will be Shemitah again, right? That's how it will work. It's an easy cheshbon. So I made it easier according to Shita of Rabbanan. There's a machloket, Tanaim, Rabbanan, and Rabbi Yehuda, how you cheshbon, how you calculate the years of Yovel. And it's as follows. Every 7 years is Shemitah. The 8th year is the first year of the next Shemitah. So the 14th year is going to be Shemitah again. The 21st year is going to be Shemitah again, right? And the Yovel is going to be what year? 49, right? It will be, so the problem is not that. The problem is 49 is Shemitah, not Yovel, right? And the 50th will be Yovel. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, 50th year, who is Yovel, is also the first year of the next cycle of Shemitah. So that means in 100 years, you have 2 cycles of Yovel plus 2 years. Right? According to Rabbanan, it's easy. Because 49th year is that, 50th year is Yovel, 51st year is going to be the first year of the next Shemitah. So every 50 set years is going to be a Yovel. So in 100 years, you have exactly 2 Yovels and no change. Right? So if it would be according to Chachamim, it would be super easy. You just see how many years you're past Churban Beit HaMikdash. You add 1 year, you take all the hundreds out, and you divide it by 7, and you have easily your, let's say if you have, 15, well, you put the Yovels out as well, but if you have, your change is, 13 years, then you'll know that next year is going to be Shemitah. That's how it will work. It's simple, easy. According to Rabbi Yehuda, which our Gemara is going to go with Rabbi Yehuda, then the way you would do it is you add 1 year from the time from the Churban. You add 1 year because Churban happened 1 year after Shemitah. So you add 1 year to go to the previous Shemitah year right prior to Churban, a year before. And then you count the hundreds, and for every 100 years that you knock out, you add 2 years, because you have 2 years change. And then you'll have your cheshbon. You divide that by 7, and you're good to go. That's basically what the Gemara is going to say. So that's an easy way, if you don't have a calendar, how to calculate the years of Shemitah. And again, this is a machloket in Masechet Narim of Samech Aleph. This is machloket Tanaim, and it becomes very interesting because you realize that there are 3 shitas as far as Shemitah is concerned nowadays. So there are those who say Shemitah could be the Rabbanan. There are those who say Shemitah could be Deoraita in some aspect of it. And there are those who hold that Shemitah is not applicable nowadays. So if you say that Shemitah is either Deoraita or the Rabbanan, I understand why you need to calculate this in the time of Galut. If you say Shemitah is not at all applicable, then it will become more complicated. Why the Gemara is even giving a formula how to calculate the years of Shemitah. But be that as it may, let's read the Gemara together. Amar Rav Huna b'reit Rav Yehoshua, Hayman delo yada kama shnei b'shavuahu. If you don't know how many years of Shemitah you're holding on, nitvi chat shata, add 1 year to the amount of years that has passed from Churban HaBayit, v'nichshuv klali beyovel, uprati beshavui, and then you could calculate the klalim of Yovel. That means for every Yovel, every 100 years you knock out 2 Yovels, and you have a remnants of 2 years according to Rabbi Yehuda, which this Gemara is following, the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. V'nishkol mi me'at tereh v'nishti aprati. For every me'ah shana, for every 100 years that you're knocking out, add 2 years to the single years that are left, which you're going to be dividing to 7. And then you divide that to 7, and you will know which year of the new cycle of Shemitah you're standing on. That's super easy. Okay, we have it? Good. Says the Gemara, for you to know that you have to add 2 years per every 100 years. Pasuk says, amazing. It's a shratayim bekerev haaretz. So when you want to calculate the dinim, the halachot of karkaot, of eretz, of shemitat ksafim, shemitah of the land, you add 2 years per 100 years. Amazing. Amar Rav Chanina, achar 400 shana lechurban. This is an interesting Gemara of what level of emunah you have to have for coming of Mashiach. Now, says the Gemara, after 400 years after the Churban HaBayit, which would be the Cheshbon of Yemot HaMashiach, says the Gemara, Im Yomar Lecha Adam, Kach Sadeh Shave 1,000 dinarim bedinar echad. If someone comes and wants to sell you a land that is worth, in market value, of 1,000 dinarim bedinar echad. So here it is, the bargain of the century. I'll give it to you for 1 dinar. It's worth 1,000 times more. Says the Gemara, it's not a good deal. Don't buy it. Lo tikach. Don't buy it. Why not? Because what's going to happen? Mashiach's going to come, and it's the whole deal is batil, right? It's not worth anything. B'matnita Tana, in the Braita we learned, Achar 4,231 shana lebriat haolam. The years of matnitin, of Braita, is given not after the Churban, but rather after Briat HaOlam, right? And what's going to be that? After 4,231 years of Briat HaOlam. Now this is 3 years off from the previous Shita. It's 3 years more, right? Because the other one would be 28. You remember how we did the Cheshbon, right? That the Churban HaBayit was, and here the change of it was 28, this one is 31, right? So this is, instead of having, because we have 2,000 years of Tohu, and afterwards we had, what was the number that we had? What's the number that we had? 1828, right? So you add that together with the 2,000 before, it will be that amount. So it says the Gemara over here, Arbat alaf, if you have 4,200, and instead of 28, it will be 31, the Briat HaOlam, Im Yomar Lecha Adam, the same thing. If a person tells you, Kach Lecha Sadeh Shaveh 1,000 dinarim bedinar echad, al tikach. If someone wants to sell you something worth so much, with so little, still don't buy it. My benaihu, what's the difference between the Braita and the previous Shita that we learned? Ika benaihu tlatsheni, the matnita tafya tlatsheni. The Braita is 3 years more than the previous one, because again, we said before that 172 years after Churban, the 4,000 finished, right? The 4,000 years finished 172 years after the Churban, and that would be year 4,000. Now add on them 231 that the Braita says, that means now it's year 403, right? So that means the year 231 that the Gemara says 4,231, that would be 403 years after the Churban, because you have 231 plus 172, and that would be 403. So whereas the previous Shita said 400 years after, this one would happen to be 403 years after the Churban. Okay, so that's what the Gemara says in when the time of Mashiach is going to be, and therefore what's considered a good deal, what's considered a bad deal. Once we add this, I want to just mention one little tidbit over here, which is important. You find many Gedolei HaOlam that they actually predicted the time of Mashiach, which seems to be a very interesting phenomenon, because the Psukim in Daniel, which actually is the place in Tanakh that gives you the time for Mashiach, in the Nevuah of Daniel HaNavi himself, it says, I saw it and I didn't understand it. And the Malach that was there, and again, Daniel's asking him, it says, what does this mean? I don't understand. It says it's going to be covered at Et Ketz. That means nobody's going to understand it until Et Ketz, until the Ketz comes, until the time of Mashiach itself. Now, you have to understand, if the Navi says that, so then what exactly would be your attempt to predict the time of Mashiach? It's a very bizarre thing. And not only that, the Gemara itself says, Tipach rucham shel mechashvei kisin. Right? The Gemara gives an official klala, a curse, to someone that tries to figure out when Mashiach comes. So hence, I always had a problem when you see the great names in the history, they try to figure out when Ramban, for instance. Ramban was forced into a debate with the church, in front of the church and the king, with his former Talmud who became a Meshumat. Pablo Cristiani was his new name. And he convinced the king and the church that if he debates and wins the leader of the Jewish community, they could force convert all of the Jewish community to Christianity. So hence, they had an enforced public debate of 3 days in front of everyone, and it was the most humiliating, embarrassing experience for this guy, Pablo Cristiani, and by extension for the church. And Ramban, because of that, had to actually accept exile on himself, and he spent his last 3 years in Eretz Israel, which he writes actually that he attributed this to his shita of mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Israel. The Ramban, one of the disagreements that he had with the Rambam, which is mentioned in Ramban's notes on Sefer HaMitzvot, mitzvot sheshechachan harav, he in his notes to Rambam, and Sefer HaMitzvot, he calls his arguments with the Rambam the mitzvot that Rambam forgot, right? So in Mitzvot Aseh Dalet, he writes, he counts the conquest and the living in Eretz Israel and Mitzvah Deoraita even nowadays, right? So he attributes this hashgacha for him to be pushed to go to Eretz Israel alone without his family and spend his last years there as a providence because of his shita of the mitzvah deoraita of living in Eretz Israel. But be that as it may, the Ramban debated, and at the end of the debate, towards the end of the debate, he writes there that he told people that when discussing the psukim that this guy brought as being messianic verses, he actually gives a year. He gives a year that was over 150 years after himself. So he apologizes first from the people. Says, "Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you because it seems like no one here is going to really see that day, but it's going to be in that date." He gives a proper date for coming of the Mashiach. Rav Sadia Gaon gave a date for coming of Mashiach. And finally, I actually was very happy to see that somebody asked this question, and that's the Rambam. Rambam, in one of his letters, he actually brings up Sadia Gaon, and then he says, I don't understand. How in the world can you give a date for the coming of the Mashiach? And Rambam says, well, he brings the challenge with this of the Gemara that gives a klala and so on, and says, you know what? Maybe it's because Rav Sadia Gaon wanted to give hizuk to people. Rav Sadia Gaon dealt with a very, very difficult society that was in front of him. Rambam elsewhere writes that if it wasn't because of Rav Sadia Gaon and himself, this is the Karaites would have completely influenced and destroyed the Yiddishkeit in their time, right? So he says maybe he wanted to give chizuk and lift up the spirit of the people. Therefore, he said what he said, and so on. Therefore, he tried to calculate according to his cheshbon when Mashiach is going to come, in order to give some chizuk to people. Right? Fine. So at least somebody asked the question. Then I'm reading the Rambam, and literally two pages later, in the same letter, in the same tshuva, he himself gives a year for coming of Mashiach. He says, let me tell you, I have a tradition in my family also when Mashiach is going to come, and he gives a year. The Mishnah Berurah gave a year. The Chafetz Chaim, in Mishnah Berurah, in Birur Halacha, he gives a year, which passed about some 40 some years ago, right? So it's a difficult thing to exactly understand why it is that people attempted. But one of the perhaps possible terutzim is when it says ad et ketz, it means until the generation itself. Maybe in the generation itself it will be more of revelation of the years. But nevertheless, the Chazal say sometimes Ben David does not come unless it's mitoch hesachadat, when they gave up already on him. And Mashiach is going to come. So it's something very interesting to delve in why it is exactly that many Gedolei HaOlam, many Rishonim, Geonim, and even Gedolei Achronim, they attempted to calculate and give years of Galut and the final redemption of Mashiach, and the downsides of that, and how to match that with the Gemara that clearly says don't do that, and with the Psukim in Daniel that seems to say don't waste your time doing it because no one is going to understand it. So how that exactly is going to work is a very fascinating topic, perhaps not for now. So says the Gemara, we have 3 years difference, but either on year 400 after Churban or 403 after Churban, because again, the Braita says on year 4,231, that would be 403 years after the Churban, is the time basically ready for the final redemption. Therefore, don't invest your money in real estate in that way. Now, there's an interesting Pelei Yoetz. Rabbi Eliezer Papo says that in Chutz La'aretz you should never buy houses. He says, well, what are you doing buying houses in Chutz La'aretz? He says, a person should be always wanting to go to Eretz Yisrael and to live in Eretz Yisrael, so don't invest your money. Of course, do not act upon these things. Everyone has to ask their local Moreh Horav what to do with their investments and so on. Sometimes the family needs dictate that the person should do. But again, this is a mindset that the Gemara had, is a Yiddish mindset that we are ready for Geula, we are ready for Eretz Yisrael, and it's something very beautiful in its core to think about. So says the Gemara, Hahu shtara, davktiv be, shit sheni yeterata. There was a shtar that came to the Bet Midrash, the Bet Din, that seemed to be post-dated 6 years. 6 years nevertheless. So 6 years of addition years in this shtar. Sabu Rabbanan Kamed, the Rav, the Chachamim in the Bet Midrash, thought to say that this should be a shtar meuchar, right? The Chachamim who were there in the Bet Midrash, the right Kisa should be Rab Nachman. They wanted to say that this should be a shtar meuchar. Now, shtar meuchar is kasher. It just has its halachot, and you have to wait until that time and so on. We mentioned before that shtar mukdam is pasul. If a shtar is predated, it's pasul, because you're giving shibud, you're giving rights to the person holding this shtar over the guy that wrote the shtar, that owes him money. You're giving rights to his karkaot, to his lands and assets earlier than it's supposed to be. And whoever has had dealings with him between the time of your shtar, which is predated, to the actual time that you dealt with him in business, will be cheated right now, because your shibud is going to be halachically by your document prior to their shibud, whereas in fact their shibud should be first, and therefore shtar muktam is pasul. Right? But shtar meuchar is kasher. If you have a post-dated shtar, it's kasher. We explained that that's why if you make mistakes in ktuvah and you write it earlier than the actual wedding happened, then the ktuvah is pasul perhaps. So that's important to note for Mesadrei Kiddushin, that they do a ktuvah earlier in the day, and then the chuppah is going to actually be later. If they didn't do a kinyan with the chatan, and the chuppah happens actually after sunset, which is the next day, if they didn't do any kinyan on the shtar from before, that's for sure a problem, because the shtar of the ktuvah has yesterday's date on it, but the marriage actually did not happen until the next day, and that will be a shtar muktam. And shtar muktam, a predated shtar, is pasul. A post-dated shtar is kasher. So they thought that this shtar is post-dated by 6 years, nonetheless, and it's kasher, but you have to hold it, and so on. Says the Gemara, Rav Nachman told them, no, not necessarily. They thought, Lememar hashtar meucharu neakve, let's hold it off and not let it go through, ad demat yazimne, until its time comes.
Was it common to post dates after the Shemitah year?
Well, even if it becomes after, and the person is going to have a proper crucible, that will be perhaps a thing. But let's knock that out. That's not the question over here. The question is if it's a post-stated or is not post-stated. So says Rab Nachman something very interesting. Amar lahem Rab Nachman. Rab Nachman told them, Hai Safra Dav Kana Katve. This star is written by a sofer that's very careful. So says the Gemara, Vehanach shitshnin de malchu be'elam de anan lo chashvinan lehu hu kachashiv le. Says perhaps this sofer actually is a very exacting sofer, and those 6 years that we've been speaking about for past 2 shiurim of the beginning of the Greek Empire, that they started their malchut only over the country of Elam, that we don't count because it was not a world power yet, it was not an empire yet. This sofer has counted those 6 years as well. So really the star is dated for this year, but the reason that you see a 6 years addition to the years that we count from the beginning of the Greek Empire is because they had extra 6 years that they started their malchut in Elam, and we don't count that those 6 years, and this sofer has counted. So it seems like it's for 6 years from now, but really it is a reference to this year that we're in. Okay, and therefore this is for this year, not for 6 years from now. The Tani Rabbi Yossi Omer, as we learned in Braita, Rabbi Yossi says, Shesh shanim malchu be'elam v'achar kach pashta malchutan bechol ha'olam kulo. That they had 6 years in Elam, and afterwards their malchut spread throughout the world. Matkif la Rab Acha bar Yaakov mimay de malchut Yivanim maninan dilma litziat Misraim maninan. Says the Gemara, who says even that we count from malchut Yavan? In other words, for the whole past daf, we have had this notion that we count from malchut Yavan. Right? From the Goyish calendar, for the Goyish kings. And says the Gemara over here, who says that we count from Malchut Yavan? Maybe, says Rabbi Acha bar Yaakov, we count from Yetziat Mitzrayim. Maybe we count from Yetziat Mitzrayim. And if you count from Yetziat Mitzrayim, then it's going to be exactly 1,000 years more. V'shafke le'alfa kama, we drop the first 1,000 years, and therefore we start from a single years afterwards. In other words, not to make things complicated right now. We say this year is what year? Tafshin Pei Gimel. It's not Tafshin Pei Gimel. Tafshin Pei Gimel means 783. Are we in the year 783? No. You're 5,783. So the thousands you drop, and you write only the change, so to speak. So it says the Gemara, maybe that's exactly what we do in the shtarot there. We drop the thousands and we count the hundreds. And how does that work exactly? Let's do the math. Take your calculators out. If you have 480 years that happened from the beginning of from Yetziat Mitzrayim until the Binyan Habayit, right? We have 400 years there, and you have now, in addition to that, 410 years that Beit HaMikdash stood, Beit Rishon stood, right? And then you have 70 years afterwards that the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, and you have another 420 years that Beit Sheni stood. You end up with what number exactly? 1,380. So what's the 380? You remember the 380 up there? 380 was the exact number of years that the Greeks started before Churban Beit HaMikdash. Right? It was 386 minus 6 was 380. So there are two cheshbonot. One is 380 prior to Churban was basically the Malchut of Yevanim, or it was 1,380 from Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's exact, the change is exactly the same. So says Rabbi Acha bar Yaakov, who told you that we're counting from Malchut Yavan altogether. Maybe we're counting from Yetziat Mitzrayim because that's when we became a nation. And we're counting to our own cheshbon. And therefore, we are dropping the 1,000 years and counting the hundreds, which is exactly the same number as the Yevanim. Right? That's a good question.
Jewish way to do it.
That's a good question. So says the Gemara, let's deal with this. Says the Gemara the following. Let's just finish this quickly. So Rab Nachman answers him. So in other words, and the nafkamina is that this shtar would be shtar meuchar now. It's 6 years. If you say we're counting by Yevanim, I understand why it's 6 years later, because there's this 6-year controversy in Malchut Yavan, in the Greek Empire, that they had the first 6 years. We don't count it, we do count it. So you could say that this shtar is not shtar meuchar. But if we count from Yetziat Mitzrayim, it's most definitely meuchar. So says the Gemara, Hamar Rab Nachman begola en monin ela lemalchei Yevanim. He pushed him away basically. He said, no, in Galut we only count from the Greek Melachim, from the Goyish kings. So who savar? He thought that he's pushing him off. He's pushing him away with a straw, basically. But he went and he paid attention and he found that he's correct. There's no way that this is going to be counting from Yetziat Mitzrayim. Why? The Tanya, because the Braita says that in Galut we only count from the Malchei Yavan, the Greek kings. Bilvad. We follow the calendar and the years of Malchei Yavan. Amar Ravina, Matnitina Midaika. Ravina said, it's not only from there, but I could prove it to you from our own Mishnah. The Tan, because he says, Be'echad b'Nisan Rosh Hashanah limlachim. Rosh Hashanah of the Melachim starts from Nisan, right? And for Regalim, and for Regal also, because, again, Nisan is Rosh Chodashim, Rosh Hashanah is not the beginning of the year, it's actually the 7th month, right? Velirgalim, says the Gemara, Ve'amrinan lemelachim lemai hilcheta. When we say lemelachim, what's the halacha? Amar Rav Chisda leshtarot. Rav Chisda says it's for shtarot. Utnan be'echad b'tishrei Rosh Hashanah leshanim. Beginning of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah for shanim, for years, and also for Shemitah, and that's all be'echad b'tishrei. Ve'amrinan leshanim lemai. What's the shanim? For shtarot. So Rav Chisda says, l'shtarot. So kasha shtarot ahadadi. One place you say, Rosh Hashanah l'shtarot is Echad b'Tishrei. The other place you say Echad b'Nisan. So do you start for shtarot by Nisan, or do you start by Tishrei? So says the Gemara, Umeshaninan kan lemalchei Israel, kan lemalchei ovdei kochavim. Here is for Malchei Israel that we start from Nisan, and for Malchei ovdei kochavim starts by Tishrei. So says the Gemara, lemalchei ovdei kochavim mi Tishrei maninan, lemalchei Israel mi Nisan maninan. Ve'anan Hashtan says, Ravina, nowadays we count from Tishrei. We know that in the shtarot in Bavel, in the time of the Amoraim, we count from Tishrei. That means if a melech, a king, becomes a king on Elul, right? In Elul becomes a king. By Tishrei already, we count the second year. Even though that's second month, really, what's the second year? So we know that. So therefore, it must be that we are counting a Goyish calendar, not a Jewish calendar. So don't you tell me that we are counting from Yetziat Mitzrayim, because if we would be counting from Yetziat Mitzrayim, the changing point of every year would be Nisan, not Tishrei. Now, by us, says the Gemara, the changing point of the year is on Tishrei. And if it's Tishrei, it means that we're counting the Malchei Umot HaOlam, the Malchei Yavan, and that's your answer. If it would be in Yetziat Mitzrayim, we would be counting from Nisan. Ba'ile mimni and alav shema mina. Don't you see from here lemalchei vanim maninan shema mina? And that concludes really the whole mathematics and cheshbon of years over here. We're back now to the prime sugya of the chagim of the chavim, back to our own Avodah Zarah sugya, and Be'ezrat Hashem will continue this in the days to come.